What I'd like to do here is give a talk that's in three parts. First, I'd like to make some general points about nuclear weapons. Second, I'd like to talk about the Israeli nuclear deterrent all by itself, the Israeli nuclear program. And then I'd like to talk about the Israel-Iran conflict and what that means for the possibility of nuclear proliferation, nuclear arms control, or maybe even nuclear war. So again, general points about nuclear weapons, focus exclusively on Israel, number 2, and then Israel-Iran is number 3. Just a couple points to start. It's very important to understand that nuclear weapons are the ultimate deterrent. They're not a perfect deterrent, but in terms of the weaponry that one can acquire, that a state can acquire to maximize its prospects of survival, nuclear weapons are what you want. Ehud Barak, former prime minister and defense minister in Israel, has said, the reason I believe Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons is because it makes so much sense. In other words, Barak understands if he were an Iranian, he'd acquire nuclear weapons. I have said publicly on numerous occasions that if I had been the Iranian national security advisor over the past 20 years, they would already have nuclear weapons. It makes eminently good sense to me that Israel has nuclear weapons and that Iran wants nuclear weapons. Again, it's because they are the ultimate deterrent. Second point you want to keep in mind is that nuclear weapons are basically weapons for peace. If you have a Middle East where every state has a survivable nuclear deterrence, the likelihood of war is much less than if you have a Middle East where nobody has any nuclear weapons. And it's because nuclear weapons are weapons of mass destruction. It's hard to imagine scenarios where they would be used. And if you have two countries that have nuclear weapons in the Middle East or any place else on the planet, they're unlikely to go to war with each other for fear that they'll get incinerated. But the problem that you face is you can't be sure that they won't be used. It's very important to understand that. They are the ultimate deterrent. They make for a more peaceful world, but you can't be sure they won't be used, which raises the question, how do you think about them? And the best example to highlight this has to do with the Cold War. We've run the Cold War one time. We ran it with nuclear weapons. Let's say we run the Cold War again, and you have a choice. You can set up the architecture under which the Cold War is run. You're God, right? You have two choices. You can run it again with nuclear weapons, or you can run it again without nuclear weapons. Which one would you choose? If you run it with nuclear weapons, it's highly likely that you will not have a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. If you run it without nuclear weapons, just conventional forces, it is much more likely that you'll have a war between the United States and the Soviet Union. Which do you choose? There is no approved solution here. It's really a matter of taste. I'd do it with nuclear weapons again, but I would not sleep well at night because there's always a possibility that nuclear weapons will be used. So what I'm saying here is they are the ultimate deterrent. They make for a more peaceful world, but it's much more complicated than that. Third point you want to think about is proliferation. Proliferation has two dimensions. One is the actual proliferation process, where a state is in the process of acquiring nuclear weapons. And then there is proliferation where the other side has now acquired nuclear weapons. Proliferation has taken place in the Middle East. 5 countries now have nuclear weapons, right? There's a difference between getting there and being there. And getting there is a very dangerous process because there's a powerful incentives for other countries to attack your nuclear facilities before you weaponize. And of course, this goes to the Israel-Iran case. If Iran really does begin to go down the nuclear weapons road in a meaningful way, right, the incentives for the Israelis to attack it in the process are very powerful. You also want to remember, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's important that it have a survivable nuclear deterrent, right? In other words, if the Israelis were then to attack, or the Americans were then to attack Iran, if its nuclear deterrent was survivable, that would be very different than if Iran had nuclear weapons that were sitting on an airfield and were a big fat target for the Israelis or for the Americans. So if you're going to have proliferation and states are going to acquire nuclear weapons, the best situation is for those states to have survivable nuclear deterrents so they can retaliate after they're hit. Fourth point you want to keep in mind, it is in America's interest, and we act this way, to make sure that there is no proliferation. We are adamantly opposed to proliferation, period. And from our point of view, the best possible situation is one where there's only one state on the planet that has nuclear weapons. And guess who that is? Uncle Sam. Okay, we do not like proliferation. All of this is to say that Israel and the United States have the same interest when it comes to Iran. The Israelis don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons for all the obvious reasons, and we don't want them to have nuclear weapons. With regard to Israel itself, and I'll talk about this in a few minutes, we did not want Israel to have nuclear weapons, right? So the United States and Israel have fundamentally different views on the Israeli nuclear deterrent, and whether it's good that Israel has nuclear weapons and that Israel has not signed the NPT. But on Iran, our views coincide. Final point I want to make has to do with enrichment and reprocessing. There's two technologies that really matter, and I'll talk more about this when we get to the Iranian case. Enrichment, where you enrich uranium, and reprocessing, where you reprocess plutonium to produce bomb material. In other words, you can go down two different roads to get that fissile material that makes a bomb. You can reprocess plutonium, that's what the Israelis did, or you can enrich uranium, and that's what the Iranians are doing. And to get way ahead of myself, what drives the Israelis crazy about Iran's capabilities is not that they have nuclear reactors. That's not a big deal. What really matters is they can enrich and they can reprocess. And as long as you can enrich and you can reprocess, it's not that hard to get a bomb. And the Iranians, as I'll talk about, are not that far away from having a bomb. It's because of that enrichment capability and that reprocessing capability. Okay, those are my background points, and they, of course, will feed into much of what I say here. We start with the Israelis and talk about, first of all, the basic history, how they got the bomb. Let me then describe their nuclear arsenal, and then we talk about its usefulness. The Israelis started down the road in the mid-1950s. David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, was deeply committed to making sure that Israel had nuclear weapons. And his right-hand man was Shimon Peres, who when I was young was a big muckety-muck in Israel. And he and Ben-Gurion got the program started, I would say, in a big way in the late 50s, 56, 58. And believe it or not, what made it possible was assistance from the French. The French and the Israelis were quite close at the time. And as I told you, the Americans did not want Israel to have nuclear weapons. And I'll say more about that. But the French and the Israelis had a lot in common, and the French were willing to give the Israelis a reactor and reprocessing capability, the ability to reprocess plutonium. And once the Israelis had that, right, they're off to the races. Just a quick point on this, as many of you remember, there was a very famous war in 1956, sometimes called the Suez War. It's where Britain, France, and Israel. Britain, France, and Israel attacked Egypt. That is evidence of the Israelis and the French working together. And again, the French played a key role in giving the Israelis the necessary technology. It was not us that did it, it was the French. Second point you want to remember, if you look at the story of proliferation during the Cold War, before 1968, it was reasonably easy for a country to acquire reprocessing capability and enrichment capability. Because the United States and the Soviet Union, both of whom opposed nuclear proliferation, were so busy competing with each other. The intensity of the security competition in the first half of the Cold War was so intense that they did not cooperate sufficiently to prevent proliferation. It's a very interesting situation. Both the Soviets and the Americans were opposed to nuclear proliferation, but they couldn't cooperate enough to really slow it down because they were involved in an intense security competition between themselves. By the late 60s, they come together. The NPT, 1968, the Nuclear Suppliers Group, 1975, and they don't completely shut down proliferation, but they do a great deal to shut it down. The Israelis, because they started in the 50s, as I described to you, got in before the Soviets and the Americans really cracked down. So it was in December 1963 that the Israelis' nuclear program went critical. In other words, they were producing the fissile material. And then it's somewhere between 66 and 67. You can't get the exact date in the open literature that the Israelis actually had a bomb. It's 66, 67. So you can see the Israelis got in early. They were very lucky in that regard. A lot of other countries did not get in early. And furthermore, they had help from the French. What about the United States? A couple points there. As you know, I wrote this book on the Israel lobby with Steve Walt. There's no question that there's lots of evidence of the lobby at work, supporters of Israel in the United States who were working to make sure that we did not slow down the Israeli nuclear program. But I'm not sure they were that necessary, in large part because the person who was really committed to preventing Israel from getting nuclear weapons was John F. Kennedy. And he was shot on November 22nd, 1963. And LBJ, as you well know, became the president. And LBJ had a love affair with Israel that was not altogether unlike Joe Biden's love affair with Israel. And the end result is that Johnson basically looked the other way. So it was Johnson, coupled with the power of the lobby, that really slowed us down from discovering and stopping the Israeli program. We kind of knew it was there, but looked the other way, is really what happened there. It's also just important to understand that, and I'll give you some of the reasons why in a few minutes, there was significant opposition inside of Israel to developing a nuclear bomb. Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres, really had to push very hard to get it through. And it wasn't so much significant opposition from the outside, although the United States was deeply committed to some extent under Kennedy, but not so under Johnson, to slowing or stopping the Israelis. But there was opposition, significant opposition from within. Final point just on the history here. The Israelis have never admitted that they have nuclear weapons. It's one of these bizarre situations where they have what's called an opaque deterrent. They're not really fooling anybody, and I don't know why they insist on saying we're not going to confirm or deny that we have nuclear weapons. They do have nuclear weapons, which brings me to their arsenal. They have 90 plus warheads. I wouldn't be surprised if their number of warheads were up in the hundreds. Most people think they've produced enough plutonium, they've enriched, reprocessed enough plutonium for somewhere between 100 and 200 warheads. But most people give them 90 warheads, 90 plus warheads. And they really don't need more than that, as I'll make clear in a moment. And as you know, when you have nuclear weapons, remember what I said, you want to have a survivable nuclear deterrent, right? The Israelis want to make sure that if Iran ever gets nuclear weapons, there's no way that Iran in a first strike can take out Israel's nuclear arsenal, or any other country for that matter can take out their nuclear arsenal. So what the Israelis have done is they've deployed their warheads on 3 different kinds of systems. This is what the United States and the Soviet Union back in the day, Russia today, China today do. You put them in the ground or on the ground, land-based ballistic missiles, either in a silo or on a mobile platform. That's land-based ICBMs. Or you put them out in the water, in a submarine, or you build bombers or fighters that can bomb targets from the air. Airplanes, sea-launched missiles, and land-based missiles. That's the triad. The Israelis have, I think they used to have Jericho 1s, and they now have Jericho 2s and Jericho 3s. Those are the land-based missiles, basically hid in mountains during peacetime and rolled out on mobile platforms in wartime. They also have Dolphin class submarines. I think they have either 5 or 6 Dolphin class submarines that have cruise missiles that are nuclear armed. And then they have F-15Is and F-16Is. These are fighter planes that are adapted to carry nuclear weapons. So they have this triad, and it is survivable. And it is quite large. Now, very interesting question is, what's the usefulness of this nuclear deterrent? And my argument is not very useful at all. And I think this is why a number of people in Israel, and these were not, peace-loving dopers, a number of, hardline people said, we don't need nuclear weapons. We're better off taking our precious resources and spending them on conventional forces or what have you. But here's why they're not very useful. First of all, Israel has the most powerful conventional military forces in the Middle East, number one. And number two, it's joined at the hip with the United States. What does it need nuclear weapons for? What's the threat out there, except for the possibility of Iran, which we'll get to? What's the threat out there that they have to worry about? Or what military scenario might they get into where nuclear weapons are useful? The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, nuclear weapons. The Israeli-Hezbollah conflict, nuclear weapons? I don't think so. The Israeli involvement in Syria? I don't think so. I mean, the collateral damage would be enormous. You're going to start popping off nuclear weapons in southern Lebanon or Syria or in Gaza. This is just, it's ludicrous. It's just not going to happen. And again, they have the conventional forces, and they're joined at the hip with the United States. So why do you need nuclear weapons? The other thing is, and this is a very important argument, it gives others incentives to get nuclear weapons. In other words, if you, Israel, have nuclear weapons, the Iranians are going to want nuclear weapons. One of the real problems here, and we can talk about this, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, the Saudis have said they're going to get nuclear weapons. If the Saudis get nuclear weapons, the Turks are going to get nuclear weapons, the Iraqis are going to get nuclear weapons, the Egyptians are going to get nuclear weapons. The nightmare scenario here from Israel's point of view, and even from the United States' point of view, is not just that Iran gets nuclear weapons and then you have Iran and Israel, which is very dangerous in and of itself, as I'll make clear. But the problem is that others will have an incentive to get nuclear weapons too. So the argument can be made that if you're an Israeli, a much smarter strategy is to hedge. In other words, sort of have the capability to build nuclear weapons rather quickly if need be. But given the situation that you're in now, don't build nuclear weapons, don't have any nuclear weapons capability, because you don't want to incentivize other countries to follow in your footsteps. Now, how you think about that, by the way, gets back to the earlier point that I made to you about, do you want to live in a Middle East where every state has nuclear weapons, survivable nuclear deterrence, and war is not likely at all? Or do you want to live in a Middle East where nobody has nuclear weapons? And the Israeli view is, we want to live in a world where only one country has nuclear weapons in the Middle East, and that's us. And that's perfectly logical from a strategic point of view. Now, just one quick story that I always find very interesting on where Israel's nuclear deterrent came in very usefully, or proved to be very useful. 1973, most of you are too young to remember this, but in 1973, the Egyptians attacked across the canal, Suez Canal, into the Sinai, and the Syrians attacked in the Golan Heights. The Israelis got caught with their pants completely down. Right, the Great Surprise Attack on October 7th was the second time that Israel has been a victim of an almost complete surprise attack. And the Israelis thought that this was the end. They really did think it was the end, because the Egyptians and the Syrians did very well in the first 2 or 3 days of the battle before the Israelis turned the tide. And the Israelis panicked, and Moshe Dayan, who was then the Minister of Defense, went to Golda Meir, who was the Prime Minister, and told her that it was time to get the nuclear weapons out. So she gave him permission to assemble 13 nuclear weapons. So the Israelis assembled 13 nuclear weapons. And they did it in a very obvious way so that we would see it, we meaning the United States. And we would rush huge amounts of armaments to the Israelis to help them stabilize the situation and turn the tide. So in a very important way, those nuclear weapons proved to be very useful for the Israelis in 1973. But they were not useful in the way we usually think about nuclear weapons, providing deterrence or coercive capability. Okay, that's the basic story on what you have with Israel. Let's now talk about Israel versus Iran, which is an issue of huge importance. And I'm going to talk about it from Israel's point of view, because the topic that I was asked to speak about was Israel and nuclear weapons. So I want to talk about Israel and how it thinks about Iran having nuclear weapons. And again, you want to remember what Ehud Barak said and what I said about having nuclear weapons, right? There are very powerful incentives for the Iranians to have nuclear weapons. You want to understand that the United States and Israel would not be threatening to attack Iran today the way they're doing if Iran had a nuclear deterrent. The Israelis and the United States would be much more cautious. So you just want to understand there's a deep-seated sort of imperative, strategic imperative to acquire nuclear weapons on the part of Iran. And you also want to understand that from Israel's point of view, this is an existential threat, right? The idea of Iran, which is a mortal enemy, right? There's no question. You can argue about who's to blame for this situation, but there's no question that Iran and Israel are mortal enemies, and that the Iranians view Israel as an existential threat. That's why they think about getting nuclear weapons. And the Israelis think about Iran as an existential threat. And that's why the Israelis are so interested in eliminating any possibility of that happening. Okay, what's the story look like here? It's quite clear that up until 2003, the Iranians were pursuing nuclear weapons. They were bent on weaponizing up until 2003. That was the year of the first Gulf War. That was not the first Gulf War. That was, I guess, the year of the second Gulf War. That's when we invaded Iraq. We really spooked the Iranians because we took down Saddam so quickly. They backed off. And the American intelligence community has said since then, since 2003, that there's no evidence that Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons. But the problem is Iran has enrichment capability and it has reprocessing capability. You just cannot lose sight of that. And when you have those two things, or one of those two things, it's not that difficult to get a bomb. If the Iranians just had reactors, that's one thing. But when you have reactors and enrichment or reprocessing capability, real trouble. So what happens is that the Israelis put huge pressure on us, and we have our own incentives, which are very similar to the Israelis, to make sure that the Iranians don't use that reprocessing capability and that enrichment capability to weaponize. So Barack Obama works overtime to get the famous JCPOA in 2015. The JCPOA is the nuclear agreement that forces Iran to downsize its nuclear weapons capability, or its infrastructure that could produce nuclear weapons in a really serious way, right? The JCPOA, which the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans, the British, the Germans, and the French all create. We all work together, right? We all work together to make sure Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons. The Israelis, in the person of Benjamin Netanyahu, are adamantly opposed. Netanyahu does everything he can to sabotage the JCPOA. And his reason is, first of all, they have enrichment and reprocessing capability. And two, the JCPOA has sunset clauses. It doesn't last forever, right? And what Netanyahu wants is for us to not agree to the JCPOA, number one. And then once we agree, he wants us to tear it up. Well, lo and behold, who becomes president in 2017? He just became president again. And who in 2018 tears up the JCPOA, or at least pulls us out of the JCPOA? Donald Trump. So in 2018, we're out of the JCPOA for the reasons I just described to you. And Trump says, what we're going to do is come up with a new strategy. The new strategy is maximum pressure. Maximum pressure is maximum economic pressure, sanctions, tariffs, all this stuff. Economic leverage. We're going to bring the Iranians to their knees and forget this JCPOA. Joe Biden, who runs against President Trump in 2020, wins, of course. Biden becomes president in January 2021. And one of his campaign promises, and one of the things he says he's going to do as soon as he takes office is reinstitute the JCPOA, or we're going to rejoin the JCPOA. Biden fails. He fails. So JCPOA is dead. And he actually, a little bit, relaxes the maximum pressure campaign that Trump had. So where are we now? Where we are now is that the Iranians are enriching uranium. The Iranians are enriching uranium up to 60%, right? And if you can enrich uranium to 90%, you're producing enough fissile material for a bomb. And to get from 60% to 90% is a hop, skip, and a jump. It is not difficult to do. Most people I know say you can do it in 2 or 3 weeks. And you realize this doesn't mean that you get a weapon in 2 or 3 weeks. It means you have the fissile material in 2 or 3 weeks. Then you need probably a year, maybe less, to build a bomb. And then you need a delivery system as well. So it's not like in 2 or 3 weeks, if the Iranians decide to go from 60% to 90%, they have a bomb. But they have the fissile material. And that, of course, spooks us, and it spooks the Israelis. So the question is, what are we going to do? What are the Israelis going to do? This is the question of the day, right? It's just very important to understand. Once you walk away from the JCPOA and maximum pressure doesn't work, and they're enriching up to 60%, you got trouble. You got problems. Because again, the incentives for the Iranians to get the bomb are very great. We all understand that. So the question is, what do we do? Now, let me just tell you what the Israelis tried to do. In 2024, they tried to do this with Biden. The Israelis, and I'll explain this why in a minute, the Israelis by themselves can't deal with the problem. They don't have the air power. They don't have a strategic air force. They have a tactical air force, just can't do it. Not clear we can do it, and I'll lay this out in more detail in a minute. Not clear we can do it. Take out their Iran's nuclear infrastructure. Of course, the problem is even if we take it out, they'll just rebuild it, right? And I'll say more about that. But just let's talk about what happened last year. Netanyahu went to great lengths last year to bait us into getting into a war with Iran. The Israelis have a deep-seated interest in baiting us to get into a war with Iran. Trump is not a warmonger. It's just very important to understand that. Joe Biden was a warmonger, right? But even Joe Biden did not want to go to war against Iran. And the Israelis, in the person of Benjamin Netanyahu, twice tried to trap us. The first was on April 1st. On April 1st, they attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus, that's Syria, April 1st. And they killed at least one Iranian general. The Iranians said they would retaliate. The Iranians retaliated. This is the first time Iran struck Israel. You remember that? That's the night of April 13th, 14th. And then the Israelis retaliated on April 19th. And the United States was deeply involved, the Biden administration, in making sure that that didn't escalate further. Okay? That's the first attempt. Then the Israelis, on July 31st, they kill a prominent Palestinian leader in Tehran, in Iran. They kill a prominent Palestinian leader. The Iranians say, we're going to retaliate. And for the second time, April 13th, 14th being the first time, the second time, October 1st, the Iranians slam into Israel again with ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, okay? Then the Israelis retaliate on October 19th, and we get deeply involved, tell the Iranians, do not retaliate. We do not want this one to spin out of control. The Iranians don't want a war with us. We don't want a war with the Iranians, but the Israelis want a war that brings in both Iran and the United States, because they want us, the United States, to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, all of them, because they can't do it. Now, before I talk about Trump and where he's at, and there I'll conclude, let me just say a few words about why the Israelis can't do it. There are two places where they enrich. One is Fordow. This is the Iranians, Fordow, and the other is Natanz, right? And the problem with Fordow is that the enrichment capability is probably about 300 feet underneath a mountain, right? It's in a mountain. And by the way, with regard to Natanz is an easier target because the enrichment capability is not in a mountain, but they're now building new facilities in a mountain, in the Zagros Mountains. If you've ever looked at a map, the Zagros Mountains separate the old Soviet Union from Iran, and Natanz is near there. And the Israelis are building new enrichment facilities in the mountains. And Fordo is in a mountain. And by my calculations, and take these numbers with a grain of salt, because it's really hard to get highly confident data in the open from open sources. But I think that our biggest bomb, the MOB, it's called the MOB, it's a massive ordnance penetrator. MOP, massive ordnance penetrator. It is basically 30,000 pounds. Remember those heavy bombs that Biden was holding back from the Israelis that caused a lot of controversy? Those were 2,000-pound bombs. The massive ordnance penetrator is 30,000 pounds. You need a B-2 bomber to drop it. And the Israelis don't have a B-2 bomber, so they can't drop it. We can drop it. And by my calculations, based on open source material, it can go down 200 feet. It can penetrate and destroy a target 200 feet down into the mountain. But by my calculation, at Fort Howe, the enrichment capability is down around 300 feet. So I don't think we can even get to it. We may be able to get it. But here's also what you want to think about. Israelis are about 1,000 miles away from most of the targets. They got to fly long distances. They don't have a lot of refueling capability. Very important to understand, because they're going to have to spend a lot of time over the targets. Because if you do an air campaign like this, right, you got to go up there and you got to deal with the air defenses on the ground, and you got to deal with any aircraft that come up to meet you. When we bombed North Vietnam during the Vietnam War and we went up north, right, we went up with all sorts of aircraft in addition to the bombers that were designed to deal with the guns and the surface-to-air missiles that are down on the ground, and to deal with the North Vietnamese aircraft that came up to engage our aircraft. So you have to, in a way, cut the corridor, right? And that requires a lot of aircraft. It requires a lot of time over the targets, right? That's just to clear out all the defenses so that you can then bring in the forces that hit the targets down below. The Israelis don't have a strategic air force. They have a tactical air force. It's designed for fighting in and around Israel itself. It's not that big. The United States, of course, has a huge air force. It has lots of capability, cruise missiles, Tomahawk cruise missiles, you name it. The MOPs, these massive ordnance penetrators, and so forth and so on. The Israelis just don't have that, right? So the idea that they can get up there and take out all of the targets, especially Fort Howe, but I think they'd have their hands full at Natanz as well. Not going to happen. That's why they're trying to drag us in. They understand this full well. These people are not fools. I mean, when it comes to fighting wars, they know how to do it. They understand they cannot take out the target set. We stand a chance. As I told you, I have my doubts about the MOP, or the MOB. I don't know whether it's a massive ordnance bomb or a massive ordnance penetrator. I think it's MOP, massive ordnance penetrator. But anyway, we can do it. But here's the problem you face then. They'll just rebuild it. As many of you who've taken classes with me have heard me say, during the Cold War, when the Soviets exploded a nuclear weapon in 1949, that year and then for the next few years thereafter, we gave serious consideration to going in and destroying their nuclear facilities. We had nuclear weapons. They didn't. They were in the process of building them. So we said, let's think about going in there and destroying Soviet capabilities. And we decided not to do it for one very simple reason. They would rebuild. They'd go to the Ural Mountains, they'd dig in, and they'd come out with nuclear weapons, and they'd be mad as hornets. And this is the problem that you face with the Iranians, especially if the Israelis attack them. Okay, the Israelis attack them, I'm wrong, they take out their nuclear capabilities. They rebuild that capability. They end up with nuclear weapons in 7 years. They're paranoid and mad as hornets. The Israelis are paranoid and mad as hornets. And then you get into a crisis. That's not going to have a happy ending in all likelihood, right? And this is what we basically decided with the Soviets. Same thing was true with the Chinese. Unsurprisingly, both the Soviets and the Americans thought about taking out the Chinese nuclear capability before it reached fruition, for obvious reasons. And we both decided it just didn't make sense. And that's what we have decided here. That's what Biden understood. Now, that brings us to Trump. It's what Trump understands. First of all, Trump's not a warmonger. For all Trump's faults, he's not that interested in fighting wars, right? And he's made it clear to the Israelis that the military option is not on the table now. And what he says he's going to do instead is he is going to return to maximum pressure, right? Economic pressure. The question you have to ask yourself is how well that will work. It did not work very well the last time. The Iranians have figured out ways to get around it. It's not likely to work very well this time. That raises the very interesting question moving forward. Given that the United States is reluctant to do this, I mean, we may change our mind, but given that we're reluctant to do it, right, the Israelis can't do it, and maximum pressure is not working, what are the Israelis going to do? And then you run into the question, is it possible that they will use nuclear weapons against Iran's burgeoning nuclear capability? My first reaction to that possibility is that's just not in the cards. That's not going to happen. But then you say to yourself, from an Israeli point of view, this is an existential threat. This is an existential threat. And when you're faced with an existential threat, states often pursue highly risky strategies. So I would argue that there is a small chance that the Israelis might use nuclear weapons against Iran to prevent Iran from getting nuclear weapons, simply because we may reach the point where where the Israelis have no other choice. Thank you.
What you just heard was a chilling masterclass from Professor John Mearsheimer, delivered in February 2025 at the University of Chicago. He began by establishing the core paradox of his analysis, that nuclear weapons are both humanity's most terrifying invention and perhaps the most robust guarantee of peace. Then, like a clinical surgeon, he dissected the history of Israel's nuclear arsenal, its current capabilities, and its surprising uselessness against the real-world threats it faces. Finally, he led us to one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints, the Iranian nuclear question. His diagnosis was bleak. Conventional military strikes are unlikely to succeed, and maximum pressure may also fail, leaving a final, terrifying possibility that an Israel driven by existential fear has a small chance of using nuclear weapons to solve the problem. This cold-blooded realist analysis leaves us with several ultimate questions to reflect on. First, must we accept the brutal paradox that Mearsheimer describes, that a world where every nation has nuclear weapons is less likely to suffer a major war than a world with none? Second, Mearsheimer stated clearly that if he were Iran's national security advisor, he would unhesitatingly pursue nuclear weapons. Does this imply that in a threatening, anarchic world, the pursuit of nuclear weapons is in itself an unimpeachable and rational act of self-preservation? And finally, and most critically, is the dark forest that Mearsheimer reveals a world driven by fear, mistrust, and survival as the highest goal, our only and inevitable reality? Or is it a predicament that we should strive to transcend and change? We are eager to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe this masterclass on nuclear weapons has provided you with a valuable perspective for understanding our complex and dangerous world, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.